very close to an energetic gate which carries an astonishing energy of love and truth, which will no longer be denied on this planet. You know, all it requires for us right now is to choose love and to be love, no matter what. That's the path. That's the pathway home. That's exactly who we are. We are love. We love you.
Welcome back to True Reality TV, Inside LoveHasWon, episode 10. And so Mom's in Crestone now. She's begun her mission. She's quickly realizing a lot of things. She, for the first time, starts downloading the Mother God essence. She has put it out there, like declared herself as Mother God, and she is receiving the backlash. She's also having the firsthand experience of that ego judgment and that ego hate of her in Crestone. And she's also taking on these pain and suffering experiences. And, you know, through it all, Mom is, at this point, she's doing sessions with people for many, many, many years. You know, for a good 10 years, she was doing sessions daily with people, sometimes up to 15, 16 sessions a day, and getting nothing back in return, right? Like nobody's giving anything in return. She's taking on, at this point, the energies of lack and suffering. And, you know, obviously this was all interesting as it coincided with the collapse of the markets, right? And the recession that happened in 2008. So I always like to see how Mom's journey lined up to what humanity was ultimately going to go through. She had to go through it first. So that beginning of that journey was very parallel to what humanity would come to experience since 2008, which was ultimately pain and suffering, lack, homelessness, lack of stability, lack of resources. And I think for those, if we look at in the past 15 years or so, when, you know, since 2008, this is when, as a whole, you know, we saw the real ugly of humanity and of the system and of the ego, and how all it cares about is profit, and all it cares about is control and lies and power and hierarchy. And so Mom started seeing this as well within the lightworker community. As I said, her original idea was okay, let's get everyone together, right? All the light workers, let's get everyone together and let's co-create together. Let's, you know, push this movement together. And she quickly realized that all of the other light workers were not interested in doing anything with her. Even those spiritual people, even the awakened people, the fact that she was calling herself Mother God, that was an immediate no for them. And they all wanted their own show. They wanted it to be about them and their channelings and their this and their that. And they kicked her out of lightworker groups. They kicked her out of chats. Like I said, she was getting thousands of emails weekly from people pretty much just attacking her for the things she was posting, for the things she was saying. And this, again, was another realization to her of nobody's unified. And the ego still wants to keep separation, and it still wants to, and she couldn't get people together. So of course, as Mom would always do, she's like, I'm going to do it myself. You know, if nobody wants to join me, nobody wants to work with me, then I'm going to do it myself. And so here are some more stories of the years from 2008 to 2009. One was mom began working at the White Eagle in 2008. Now, the White Eagle is a hotel that is in between Crestone and Moffat. It's no longer in business. It's been deserted for many, many years now. But it was at one point a very popular place as a hotel for spiritual conferences and meetings and things like that. There actually has been some Bilderberg meetings there, which, again, brings in the kind of cabal energies that are present there as well. So mom recalled that she began working there and she was just wanting to bring more and more people there as like a gathering place, these events that they were hosting. And so the woman that she worked for there, of course, as again will be another theme of mom's life, started to get triggered by her energy. Whether it's jealousy, whether it's judgment, whatever it is, this was just inevitably what mom would always experience. And she started to cut her shifts, refuse to pay her, even though mom, of course, was doing an amazing job. She has been a supervisor running 5 McDonald's stores. The woman knows what she's doing. She knows how to bring a crowd. She knows how to provide the best and highest service. But it was just very clear that, again, mom was going to be faced with this energy of no matter what she would do and how great she would do it, she would be kicked out, she would be shunned, she would be rejected. And so ultimately, the woman ended up firing her. And at one point, she accused mom of stealing, and that was kind of the last straw for mom because she's like, I would never steal. And so mom just walked out, never went back. But prior to her leaving, she had anchored in a massive amount of energy at the White Eagle. She recalled a specific story where she was outside the White Eagle and she was facing the mountains, which are right behind it. And this was actually on February 14th, 2008. And she was downloaded with the universal laws from these mountains. And it was also at the White Eagle that mom would first get the experience of how she would come to be affected by the ego and by the lower energies, right? So she had begun to have the experience of like ascension symptoms, right? That started back in like the early 2000s. She, starting in 2008, was a little bit beginning to understand how her body would come to be reflecting events that Mother Earth was experiencing, like with her breaking her ankle the day of the BP oil spill. Again, she wouldn't put those pieces together till a little bit later. But this here at the White Eagle was also where mom first started to experience how she was affected by the density, by the ego, by the lower energy. So she recalled a story where, there was a huge Buddhist event, and it was a gathering of monks basically happening at the White Eagle. And mom was in charge of cooking for the event. So there was like hours of preparation going into cooking these meals. And as all of the monks began to arrive, mom began to feel very sick. And she was so sick, she started like spinning and couldn't actually stand up straight. And she had no idea what was going on. She said she felt like she was going to throw up. She couldn't stand up straight, but she kept pushing through it. She didn't know what was happening at the time. So she made the meals. As soon as the monks arrived, mom had to lay down and basically spend hours kind of spinning and transmuting these energies. And this is where she started realizing like, oh my God, the spiritual ego was something mom didn't necessarily discover yet, but she would very much come to figure that out. That even those who were quote unquote spiritual, even those who are quote unquote awake, that's a whole nother level of ego, of density. And this is her moment of when she first starts taking it on, as we would say. And so it was then that mom realized how fake these monks were, and that these were actually not high vibrational beings. They were simply pretending to be. And at one point, she calls one of them out, and I forget the story in its details, so I won't share it. But there was a moment of her like calling one of them out, like straight to their face. And I think that was probably also a big trigger and a spin at the time. So mom continues to get kicked out of many places in Crestone. The ego hated her. It was what it was. So one day mom was guided to go on to this land in Crestone. And it was, a lot of people own land there. And the owner of this land had told mom that she could camp on the land. So as she does, she began, because for mom, it was like wherever you go, whether you're living in a tent or you're living in a mansion, it doesn't fucking matter. You're going to make it the best you possibly can. You're going to be in right action. This is something mom always taught us was very important, was, leaving places better than we found them, in that way of like taking care of your space. Doesn't matter where it is, but to take enough self-love to give yourself the grandest space possible. Again, whether you're living in a tent or you're living in a mansion, it doesn't matter. And so she began building another beautiful campsite. She hand-laid stones. She created an outdoor kind of kitchen and sitting area. She had basically been working like night and day to kind of set up this space. So right on cue, the owner of the land and a woman approach them. They end up freaking out on mom, claiming that she moved sacred Indian stones that had been there for centuries. And mom kind of laughed and she was like, you know that the miners were here last, right? And so none of this is in its original place. Like the miners were here. This is not original ancient Indian stones. And this pretty much set him off, kicked mom off the land. And again, another lesson that mom began learning, which was she can never trust the egos, ever. They will say one thing and then they'll take it back. And this is something we've experienced extensively, both with mom on mission and after, is the ego will always sell you this great story. They'll be like, yeah, I'll help you out. Yeah, you can have, they're Indian givers. They pretend to give, but then they'll take it back. Or there's all these conditions on it. They flip-flop. They're incapable of following through. They're incapable of being in integrity with their word. They're incapable of being consistent. And this would again come to be part of mom's research into the ego. So mom had nowhere to go. At this time, she did have a friend who lived in town in Crestone who offered to let mom stay at her place one night. And I believe that this was actually around the 4th of July. And so once they arrived, mom was alone, I think, at this time. She was at the house. The roommate of the woman came home and was, of course, triggered by mom's energy. So they made mom sleep outside on basically the rocks. Gave her a blanket, and the owner was like, sorry, my roommate doesn't want you in here. So that's that. And mom just told this story where she remembered sleeping outside of this house. She's sleeping on top of some rocks, like with a blanket, and she's just like in tears and like crying because she's like, I just don't understand like what I'm doing and why this is happening to me and just why people are treating her this way. And the next day, she really wanted to quit and just go home. And, this is another part of the journey where all of us are going to hit these places on the journey where we absolutely want to give up and throw in the towel. There's so many times that I've been like, I'm done. I don't need to be here. Like humanity can kind of figure it out, right? And at this point, mom is like, she just wants to quit. Like this is not working. And this will always be a theme as well, is like the second you're like ready to give up, or the second that you think there's no way forward, there's no way out, the angels and the galactics will bring you these magical synchronistic events to kind of reheart you that the magic still does exist and that you are on the right track. And And again, following the yellow brick road and just keep following that. So she woke up the next day. It was 4th of July, and she needed to go to the bathroom. So there was a parade that day, because they do a 4th of July parade every year in Crestone. And there was a porta potty right outside of the house. So she was like, oh, great. So she goes to the bathroom. She comes outside, and she's walking down the street, and someone is exiting the cloud and offers to buy Mom a cup of coffee. And Mom has told this story many times. And she was just amazed, and she was like filled with gratitude of like, wow, okay, it's turning around, you know? And so she walks next door to, there was a restaurant at the time called Shambhala. And she sat down at a table, and immediately a waitress came over and said, hey, you know, we have a plate of food someone didn't want, or they returned it. Like, would you like it? And Mom, of course, accepted and was just kind of blown away of like, oh my God, everything's changing. You know, she was always so grateful for every little experience. And she would endure many hardships and abuses, but it was kind of moments like this that helped raise her spirits and help her to like continue on. So, you know, I guess you could say that Mom had the best of times and the worst of times in Crestone. And there was a lot to, I guess, what Mom experienced, you know, up and down with this energy. But you know, also in 2008, towards the end, Mom was actively trying to collaborate within the community. So her entire vision was basically for all of humanity to work together to create the new earth. So she was gathering light workers across the globe to participate in chat rooms, gatherings, mass meditations. And again, as I mentioned, this is when she discovered light worker syndrome, as she called it, that they were all in separation. You know, they all wanted to do their own thing, get their own glory. They had no interest in co-creating, in unity in that way. So she began writing articles for the local Crestone Eagle. At that time, Mom did write a few articles for them. And she was channeling like beautiful articles about love, consciousness, the new earth. And the editor of the paper commented that she had never seen such high consciousness writing. But eventually they too kicked Mom out and no longer allowed her to write for the paper and said, quote unquote, the writings were too high consciousness to be published. So that tells you a lot about just the constant battle that was going on. Is even people who did want to work with Mom, eventually it was either that they were triggered by her and their ego just hated her, or it was that she was just too high consciousness and people couldn't, they either weren't ready for it or they just couldn't grasp it. So Mom continued on, and some of the most powerful work that Mom did was during this time in Crestone. She did thousands of ceremonies upon the land and at the sacred sites. As I mentioned, there's a lot of sacred sites in Crestone. There's a lot of spiritual centers, but there's also like the ziggurat is there, like a spiritual monument. They have temples, so they have a lot of sacred places. So one ceremony Mom did was on the 8-8 portal in 2008, and this is known as the Lionsgate portal. And so Mom bought a dozen roses and she put on this beautiful dress. She wore high heels and literally hiked herself up the mountain to the ziggurat. And she performed a ceremony for all twin flames and for the dawning of New Earth. She also wrote letters, love letters to humanity, and left them in the sacred box outside the temple, which is up in Dabaka. Now, as a fun fact, when we were later there in 2018, we actually did find the letter that Mom had put in the box. It was still there. But then later, by the time it hit 2020, the letter was taken out and it was no longer there. So someone obviously, went in, found it, and removed it. Now, just some other like fascinating things to share that weave us into some of the team's time in Crestone as well. is mom also did a bunch of ceremonies at different locations. One was called the Labyrinth House, and it was a house with a huge labyrinth made of stones. And mom walked that labyrinth for about 2 hours, reciting prayers, intense ceremonies. And this is the things that she would do. Like, she would spend hours walking around sacred sites, praying, reading out ceremonies. Like, she was giving everything 1,000% to, bring in this new earth energy. And so when we arrived in Crestone, fast forward into 2018, mom had guided us to find this house with a medicine wheel. So it was owned by a being who mom used to be friends with, and she said she had spent many hours helping to create this medicine wheel. If you guys don't know what a medicine wheel is, you can look it up, but it's basically stones in a wheel formation. Is like a sacred geometry formation. And so we went on a little excursion to try to find this house. We actually got in touch with someone who told us, oh yeah, that house was now sold from its original owner, and it has a new owner. So we didn't know who the new owner was, and it'd be kind of weird to just like show up and be like, hey, can we see your medicine wheel, right? Because the previous owner knew who mom was. So we were hoping that he still owned it. So we were kind of like, okay, well, I guess, we're not going to be able to find it. But what happened was we were in town. We synchronistically met these two women, very cool women, don't remember their names. And they invite us over to their house. They're like, oh yeah, come over later. It was like a bunch of the team, and, we'll play music. Like, they had guitars and all this stuff. And we were just going to go hang out, maybe have a fire. Okay. So we pull up to the house, and it's the house that we were looking for. It was a fucking trip. And so we're like, okay. So we kind of tell them, like, this is really weird. We tell them the story about the medicine wheel, and these two women, like, literally are in shock. They're like, how do you know about the medicine wheel? And we explain. And the one woman said, my son, who was like a teenager, she's like, he had just begun clearing the brush in the front yard about 2 days prior and discovered the medicine wheel hidden under weeds and bushes. They didn't even know it was there when they bought the house. But 2 days prior, one of their sons was clearing out all the brush, clearing out all the bushes in the front yard, and discovered the medicine wheel. So they're in shock. We're in shock. None of us know what's going on. All we know is that mom had directed us to find this house, and this all just happened. So we find the medicine wheel. It's in their front yard, and, we did a few ceremonies there, but this was just the beginning of like realizing how profound mom's journey was. It was like a very magical experience to just kind of sum up the way that mom's energy is. And so in around September of 2009, mom launched a light center in Crestone. So it was in town behind the hotel. It's near the brewery, used to be called the Bliss. Her idea was to create a Garden of Eden and a light center where basically everyone could co-create, gather, share ideas. And she also had the idea to launch the Crystal Schools, which is going to be a higher consciousness school for children. And so she launched that. I think it was open for a couple of months, and then they ended up shutting it down like everything else. But she did lay the blueprints for that there at the time. Now, around this time, somewhere in 2009, but I think it was towards the end of 2009, mom is in the car, and the Galactics tell her to pull over, and they basically pull her into a meeting. Again, remember, mom has like full third eye vision. So when she says she has a vision, it's like it takes over her whole sight. She's there. That's all she sees is the etheric. So she gets pulled into the meeting with the Galactics, the Galactic Federation of Light specifically. And they say to her that they're starting to realize how deep the ego programming goes. And again, when Mom incarnated, they did not know how this was going to go. Nobody knew how this was going to go. And they basically said, the programming is too deep. And we were not anticipating this. And they said, this is a suicide mission that you're on right now. And we feel we need to evacuate you, meaning evacuate the essence. And Mom just said no. She was like, nope, I don't care. I'm going to go for it. Like, Mom's level of dedication to this was beyond human comprehension. And so she knew in 2009 that this was a suicide mission. So for everyone who doesn't understand Mom's journey and why it looked the way that it did, she fully understood that this was going to end in some way the way that it did. She knew she had a short period of time. She knew it was a suicide mission, but she didn't fucking care, because in her heart, she was going for it. She was going to complete her mission and her contract at all costs at this point. So around 2009, 2010, they end up moving from the forest to what is known as Desolation Row. Desolation Row is more in the Moffat area. It's outside of Crestone, and it is exactly how it sounds. It is desolate. It is just on a flat piece of the valley, and there's basically a lot of like trailer homes there. Desolation Row is an interesting place. The team lived in Desolation Row for about a year as well. And they lived in this little ski hut. So again, the same themes continue. There is still a lot of harshness to this. There's harsh winters, but at least now they have this little hut at Desolation Row. There's a whole lot of stories from Desolation Row. But again, it was Mom continuing with her sessions, continuing with her postings. She's getting more and more downloads. And she's basically just continuing on with what she had begun building. But in Desolation, she also starts like having a lot of wild experiences. Like, there was a guy in Desolation Row, who, I guess something happened, and, again, Mom was very used to the ego freaking out around her. So something happened with this guy, I think his name was Reggie, at Desolation Row, and he basically trips out one day and he puts a gun to Mom's head, and she looks at him straight in the face and she says, pull the trigger, do it. And he freaked out at that point and just pulled away, walked away. And many things like that have happened to Mom, but her way of being is that love is more powerful than fear. And she knew that the ego could only function off of fear. And Mom was absolutely fearless. And I think that people were scared of her, intrigued by her, triggered by her, hated her. There was such a wide spectrum, but I don't think anyone could deny that Mom was powerful. She was extremely powerful. And I think she was really coming into her power, around this time. And so, moving into, 2009, 2010, again, Mom's continuing on all of the same things she's doing. You can see a lot of her posts around that time, the videos she was doing. She was just putting out as much information as she possibly could. Now, in 2011, Crestone officially pushes Mom out. And Mom's talked about this. She'll say that Crestone's a place that's going to eat you up and spit you out. And a lot of people get energetically and physically pushed out of Crestone, right? Because remember, both the dark and the light exist there. It is a very challenging place to navigate, but many people are driven out of Crestone. It's definitely not for the faint of heart there. And so mom felt like she got pushed out in 2011, and they get called to go up to Oregon. This is a beautiful time in mom's life. They spent months on a farm. They were doing some, work exchange with these people on a farm. And so she's trimming trees, they're planting flowers, she's helping to take care of some of the children on the farm, they're cooking. She's really loving the experience in Oregon. She loves being in nature, cooking, caring for the plants, caring for the children. She's enjoying Oregon at this point. And people start joining her there. At this point, they had quite a following with the Galactic Free Press. They had some people that did gather with them at this time in Oregon. We actually had a woman reach out to us about, oh God, can't remember, maybe it was a year ago or 2 years ago, but there was a woman who reached out to us and said, I joined mom back when she was in Oregon. And she just said she had such fond memories of her. She, confirmed everything we already knew, but she was like, mom would work around the clock, 24 hours a day. She was like working on the website, working on the farm, cooking, cleaning, like she was nonstop. And I'm like, that's how she is. But this woman was like, I had a lot of fond memories being there. She's like, we learned so much from her. We gathered, we had tons of like great times there. And, one time in Oregon, this was where mom she had already known she was Mother Earth, right? And she had already started getting the integration of the Mother God essence since 2008. But it was in Oregon in 2011 where it clicked for her that she was embodying Mother Earth. It's when she had the physical knowing and understanding and feeling of embodying Mother Earth. So they're in Oregon, and and I think her and a bunch of the people there, they do a mushroom trip. And mom remembered laying on the earth, and she said she basically felt that she had melted fully into the ground, like she was one with the earth. And she just remembered suddenly that epiphany of like, oh yeah, I am Mother Earth. And she suddenly felt it. And the group of them were kind of gathered in the fields. They were watching a bunch of activity in the sky. And mom sees these starships come down, and they anchor onto the grid of the earth. And everyone around her saw the same thing. So she was like, confirmed. She saw these ships landing and connecting to the earth grid, and they all witnessed it. And that was a big moment for her again, because, mom had such few confirmations. She would get confirmations, from the angels and things like that. But all of these confirmations were so big for mom when other people were witnessing the same thing as her. Of like, okay, I'm not crazy. I am seeing this. This is happening. Now, after leaving Oregon, they are called to Mount Shasta, and this is around 2012, at some point of 2012, maybe even the end of 2011. We don't have exact time frames for these, but at this point, they are called to Mount Shasta. Now, Mount Shasta is another big place in mom's journey. I would say Crestone, Mount Shasta, and Florida are the three major places where mom did her main mission work. And Mount Shasta is a very, very beautiful place, a very spiritual place. I would say equal to Crestone in the fact that the veil is very thin there. But you don't have as much of the lower consciousness as much there, but it is a very profound place. And so as 2012, is prophesied, the Mayan calendar, all these things of the world's going to end, all of this stuff. So, mom knew like this was a big event, but she also knew, right? She knew back in 2008 from that email that I read that this was not about the world ending. This was about humanity waking up. This was about the earth ascending. This was about moving into the new paradigm. So at this stage, Mom had launched her tiny chat. That's what it was called back then. And it basically was a chat room, a chat room for people to get on, and they could get on video. And so she was doing live chats like every day and every night. They would be playing music. She'd be sharing updates. She'd be giving information. And Mom was anticipating that December 21st, 2012 was going to be this huge event, right? And all these people are talking about the decloakings and all of this. And so Mom told everyone in 2012, she said, the solar flash is inside. The decloaking is inside. She understood that. She was like, the solar flash is when you awaken. She said the true decloaking is when you decloak your true self to the world. She's like, everyone's waiting for these external things. She knew that the galactics weren't going to decloak in 2012. She knew that the solar flash wasn't just going to poof and happen, But I remember even back in 2008, there was a channeler who is still out there, by the way, wonderful channeler named Blossom Goodchild. Back in 2008, Blossom was putting out channeling saying that the galactics were going to decloak. And Mom said, she goes, I remember when Blossom put that out in 2008, and everyone gave her major heat for it. Because, of course, when it doesn't happen the way the mind thinks it should happen, right, they turn on you. It's kind of what goes on in the disclosure community now. So she's like, oh, when Blossom put that out, I knew she was going to get heat for it. But she goes, Blossom was right. That the galactics actually were experimenting with a possible decloak in 2008, but they determined that the consciousness wasn't ready. So Blossom was right, but she took a lot of heat when it didn't happen. And so that was kind of similar in 2012, where Mom's like, everybody's waiting for this big external thing, and it's about the internal. Right. And so she realized in 2012 that many people had too many attachments to what they thought was going to happen. So on December 21st, 2012, Mom is hosting a live tiny chat. Okay. She feels the energy come in. She said she basically saw through her third eye this huge ball of energy that came in and literally knocked her out of her chair. So on the tiny chat, she's like, falls out of her chair. And we had people who were on that chat that day that confirmed that. And she was like, I just entered the fifth dimension. Like physically, she was now anchored into the fifth dimension. And remember, at this point, she's embodying Mother Earth. So that means that Mother Earth did in fact enter the fifth dimension on December 1st, 2012. However, it is humanity that was behind schedule. It was humanity's consciousness that was not ready for that, which is why we're playing catch up now. Mom was the only vessel on the planet who was ready and able to anchor into the fifth dimension on that prophecy date, because that was the original intended date. Okay. That date was the original plan A of the physical ascension, that humanity would begin their mass awakening. They would essentially begin their ascension process. It was very clear to the galactics back in 2009 that this was not going to happen, that they were not ready. So Mom was the only vessel who was actually prepared to physically enter that state, not just consciously, physically. So she began kind of stabilizing into that fifth dimensional body from then on, what we would call the light body. Now, humanity did not wake up by this timeline intended. And so Mom had to continue on with her mission of the divine plan. So she, as I said, with Cryon, he had already began working on her brain back when she was in Texas. And this was now when he was also helping her, to basically how to navigate this. What does this look like physically? And so a lot was coming in for mom at this time. The power of her essence really began to trigger the egos around her. Okay. And so by this time in 2012, mom's coming into the mother of all creation essence. She's been anchoring in Mother God for 6 years at this point. And now after the end of 2012, moving into 2013, she is now anchoring in Mother of all creation. The totality of that essence, it kind of had to move in stages. So at this point, she is very triggering to any egos around her, specifically Amrith and Will. And, mom had said that they were both holding dark essences that they had contracted to transform, but didn't. I mean, this is just the story of everybody on the planet. We all have darkness within us, and we also all have a higher self. It's a choice to transform the lower and embody the higher. And so that's why mom had always said, she attracted both the darkest and the lightest beings to her. This was just by contract. And so as soon as mom began expanding in her essence, this is when the separation between them really started to occur. She had been with them for 6 years, but basically they could no longer sustain around her energy, and they're going to have their own perspective of the story, but this is mom's truth in the story and how it unfolded for her. And so at this time in 2013, this is when mom starts connecting with Miguel, aka Michael. And he's living in New York and works for the UN. Now, from my personal interactions with Miguel and the stories that he has told, he went through quite an awakening, which ultimately led him to finding mom. And he had cancer, had a lung removed, etc. And mom was doing sessions with him, helping him to kind of heal through that and, consciousness and all of this kind of stuff. So mom recalled one night that she had a big fight with Amrith and Will. She went into her room and was basically just crying, asking the angels for assistance. And they just said, call Miguel, aka Michael. And so she does, and the angels say, you need to tell him that he needs to come to Mount Shasta. So she does. She tells him, and he accepts. And on the trip, he got ill. Something happened with the lung situation, and he had to recover for a few weeks or something like that, maybe even longer, before he would eventually then make it fully out to Mount Shasta. Now, eventually he did make it to mom, and this is where shit kind of hit the fan. So there was other stuff going on with her, Amrith, and Will, but I don't think it's important to the story. But there was stuff going on with them that was also leading to this. Now, at this point, Amrith and Will kind of spin out. Okay, so the house that they're living in and whatever money and resources that they had built up over the last 6 years was from the website, from all the sessions that mom was doing, right? From donations, because they ended up starting to ask people. Mom was one of the first people to say, hey, can you donate to support us in the light work that we're doing? And the light worker community came for her at the time. And, it was this whole, again, light worker syndrome belief system of oh, we should be doing everything for free, and which in a way, it's of course we all want to serve and help everyone. But why is it that all of the egos can hoard all the resources, but those who are actually serving the highest good and serving humanity need to do it with nothing? Right? That is part of the consciousness. There's a huge problem with that part of the consciousness. They would rather those who are serving the highest good of all to have literally nothing, to be homeless, to have no money, to struggle and to suffer, and say, well, you should just be helping everyone for free. But yet the egos have it all. That's something humanity needs to reflect upon. And that part of the light worker consciousness was really deeply ingrained. And so they came for her. Now the light worker community all does that. And now you'll see people in the light worker community who are basically just spiritual capitalists. And they're actually not really serving the highest good at all. But that's, a story for another day. So all of the funds that they had, saved up until this point, from Mom's recollection, it was about $17,000. They had a car, they were staying in a house, they had kind of finally built themselves up to the point where they had some stability. So Amrith and Will take everything. They change the passwords to the Galactic Free Press to kick her off. They take the bank account, they have the car, they have the house, all of it. And they tell her that the only way that they are basically going to give Mom everything or split it with her or whatever is if she comes out publicly on the Galactic Free Press and denounces herself as Mother God. Okay, so this is an important part in Mom's story. Because again, this is what the egos do. And so they said, basically, we're going to take everything, like we're done with you. And the only way that we're going to allow you access to the Galactic Free Press or to any of these funds or to anything is if you come out and say, I am not Mother God. And Mom basically says, fuck you. I am Mother God. Walks away from it all. She goes outside. She said she was obviously very upset. She was spinning. She's like, okay, I'm back to having nothing, like angels. What am I going to do? Like, she's extremely distraught. At this point, Michael comes, and basically tells her like he has some funds and it's going to be okay. And, they're going to figure something out. So her and Michael basically are still in Shasta at this point. And this is when they established the First Contact Ground Crew Team website. It could have been the First Contact Ground Crew Team. There was also the First Contact Medical Ground Crew Team at the time. And so with Michael's help, basically, Mom began studying the ego-programmed mind. And so he was an important piece for Mom because he was anchoring in the essence of Archangel Michael. He did come to assist Mom. And I believe that was part of his contract, and basically was the only one with her for a long period of time. And together they were doing a lot of research into the ego program mind, because now at this point, Mom is understanding like, okay, it's not enough for me to just tell people that the ego is the problem. It's not enough for me to just be putting out the truth. We have to do something else. She knew she was taking on the pain and suffering. She knew she was constantly transforming energy, but she was like, how do we get through to humanity with this block of the ego? I have to understand this more deeply. Now, remember, she had a lot of these records from the research that she accessed from the Greys, but she has to remember this all in a physical vessel. She has to be able to pull in that information, those records, and integrate it all in physicality. Now, in 2013, Mom is called back to Crestone for the second time with Michael. She did not want to go at all. She was like, I've already been pushed out once. I don't want to go back there. And the Galactic said, you have to go back there. And Mom did not know, right? Now that she was fully anchoring in this mother of all creation essence, she did not realize she was going back to Crestone for what would become a spiritual battle. I think the first time around, it was very much a physical battle in a way, right? Like she was kind of battling against the opposing forces that were physically wanted to kick her out, physically wanted to shut her up, physically just didn't want her there. And she was under kind of a lot of that opposition and those challenges to forging forward on her mission. But this second chapter of Crestone would become a spiritual battle in which they had been preparing Mom at this point for, because again, little did she know, she was going to have to take the cabal head on. The energies of it, the dark energies that have enslaved this planet, she was going to actually be taking them on etherically, energetically, and physically. And she did not know that. Again, she entered this mission of like, love and light. It's all going to be amazing. Like, we all just need to work together and like remember who we are. Mom's coming from that place, from that genuine place. You know, she didn't go into this mission to be a warrior. She was a dreamer. She was a lover. She was a messenger. But she ended up having to become a warrior and had to take on spiritual battles that are not for the faint of heart. And so it was at this time, Mom didn't know that this was going to be, that the next, 7 years of her life were going to be that. And she was at this point being trained by Cryon to begin performing these etheric surgery sessions, right? So as Cryon had been doing this for her, he's now training her on these etheric surgery sessions, because it's becoming more and more clear that humanity is not just going to get it, that the ego is too deep, the programming is too deep. And so he started training Mom on how to do these etheric surgery sessions for people to help pretty much like deactivate the ego. They had to figure out how this was working, the levels of manipulation that were happening, also the levels of dark technology that were being used against us. All of that Mom would uncover as she began doing these surgery sessions and as she goes back to Crestone for the second time. So there was a lot of, during the surgery sessions, Mom was discovering things that she was not prepared for. She began discovering implants, negative etheric chips, and brandings that had been implanted into people's energy bodies. These were some of the toughest surgeries that Mom ever did. She recalled one particular surgery, which was the hardest for her. And this was a being who lived in Hawaii, and she had struggled her whole life. She said to Mom she felt something was off, but she couldn't figure out what it was. And when Mom went in to perform the etheric surgery, she saw that this being had no soul. And energetically, it just looked like wires. Like energetically, it just looked like a robot. And Mom was like devastated, because she was like, what have they done to humanity? What are they doing? And Mom, under universal law, has to tell the truth. And so she told this being, and she was very afraid to do this. But the being apparently was very grateful for the truth. And she said she now understood why she never felt normal. And then come to find out that her father on the islands of Hawaii was known as Mothman. And so this was, the moths can also be, there's legends and things like that of just lower energy around the moths and the moth lineage, which is not important right now. But this was basically when Mom just realized that there was way more going on than she even knew. This was beyond the ego at this point. This was beyond just humanity's programmed, humanity's amnesia. This was deeper than that. And so she began putting out this information about the surgeries, about the implants. And of course, this was more backlash from the spiritual community. And They were not happy that she was putting out this information. But lo and behold, they later started doing the same things. But this again was, I think, the moment where mom was like needing to fight harder, because the levels to which she was unraveling and uncovering what was going on, it became so much more than what she thought and what she anticipated. And so this is where she goes back to Creststone for what would become one of the biggest spiritual battles for her in the next 7 years of her journey. So that will be the next part of the story. Thank you guys for listening and for watching, and I will see you on the next episode.
We are very close to an energetic gate which carries an astonishing energy of love and truth, which will no longer be denied on this planet.